Thank you very much for that. Thank you all for joining us. Our panel today is on Black education, myths, and tragedies, a title that is an homage to a 1972 book by the prolific economist, intellectual historian, and social theorist Thomas Sowell, his first book on the role of race in American life. Drawing on his own educational experiences, ranging from segregated schools in the Deep South to some of the nation's most elite universities, Sowell sought to examine barriers to Black educational progress and, importantly, to celebrate some exemplary schools that help poor Black youth make extraordinary educational gains. Now, 50 years on, the question of how to promote Black educational achievement is as urgent as ever. COVID-related school closures, for example, appear to have had a devastating effect on student achievement, especially on low-income Black students. Schools that shifted to remote learning for longer stretches of time saw achievement gaps between white and Asian students and their Black counterparts widen considerably. And given the compounding nature of educational achievement, there's good reason to believe that this learning loss will have a durable effect. I'm delighted to be joined today by Eric Hanushek and Ian Rowe, two of the most thoughtful voices on the past and potential future of Black educational outcomes. Rick is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. He is a leading expert on the economics of education, and in particular on the role of teacher effectiveness in learning outcomes and the tight relationship between the skill levels of a given country's population and its long-term rates of economic growth. Ian is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, an innovative public charter high school in the Bronx, and until recently, the CEO of Public Prep, a public charter school network also based in New York City. Ian is also the author of Agency, the 4-point plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their pathway to power. Rick, in an important study of yours published in 2019, you found that educational gaps between Black and white students, as well as rich and poor students, haven't narrowed in decades. Strikingly, you were disagreeing with other researchers claiming that the socioeconomic gap was actually widening. If the debate is over whether the gaps are stagnant or getting worse, that seems rather discouraging. Why, in your view, are we failing to make progress? Is it that we have no concrete idea of how to address educational underperformance, or are there other obstacles to implementing reforms we know to be efficacious?
With those multiple questions, I'm not quite sure how to begin. Maybe I should begin by just reinforcing what you said, and that is, if you look around the world, at least developed countries of the world, and look at how countries reward skilled people, the US has higher rewards for skills than almost every other developed country in the world. But if you turn that backwards, it says the US punishes the lack of skills more than almost every country in the world. And that's what we see here, and that's building on what Glenn said before. We see huge differences that persist in the difference of achievement levels of Blacks and whites and poor and richer students. I got into studying education a long time ago when something called the Coleman Report came out, and maybe a few of the older people here remember the Coleman Report. It was a federal study entitled Equality of Educational Opportunity. And it got a lot of attention largely because it had sort of indecipherable statistical analysis that purported to say that schools didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the family. What was left out of that study and sort of prodded my interest slightly preceding Glenn at MIT to work on education issues was the fact that they tested 600,000 kids in the US in 1965, and it's sort of an impossible task. Nobody had ever thought of doing that. And if you look at the results of that testing of students, and you could compare by region and race differences in the level of skills, of achievement of students. At that time, a Black in the rural South in the 12th grade had the equivalent performance as a 12th grade white in the Northeast. As a 7th grade white in the Northeast, who was in the, and so there was a 5-year difference in effective learning of Blacks in the rural South. Now that closed some over time, partly I think with desegregation in the civil rights movement. And a little while ago, I tried to go back to the original Coleman data and take the racial gaps there and take the current data on racial gaps in achievement. And what you see is that there has been a closing in the achievement gaps over time. And by my estimates, the closing from 1965 to 2015, if that rate of closure continued, we could close the gap in math achievement of blacks and whites in another 2.5 centuries. That's the challenge. Right now, the racial gap between black and white students stands at a level that puts the average black student at somewhere around the 23rd percentile of the white students. That amounts to, by the calculations I said before, to meaning that on average, the income gaps that will persist over the lifetime of these students is about 19 to 20%, just from the differences in achievement. Now, the frustrating thing that was brought up is that we have some answers. We have a system called schools that are designed to try to take care of these achievement gaps in achievement. But we also see that they don't do a very good job at closing those gaps. If we look in dimensions of the bottom quarter of the family income distribution compared to the top quarter, those gaps have closed just minutely, even though starting in the war on poverty with Lyndon Johnson, we have been pumping money into schools, we have been trying to pay attention to this, and yet we allow the LA Unified School District to be closed all of last school year. And what we see is that we have not paid attention to the things that we know what to do. We know from a variety of research papers and work that effective teachers can in fact change that picture. But we don't allow our schools, or don't insist that our schools provide effective teachers to the kids that need effective teachers. It persists. And so that's the frustration that I have and that we all should have and that we should not allow to exist.
Rick, a quick follow-up for you to help us understand the nature of these gaps. There are a number of economists, yourself included, who've sought to disentangle various different considerations, factoring out, parental educational attainment, income, wealth, family structure, a range of other factors. Once you account for these potentially relevant considerations, presence of books in the home, et cetera, what is the residual gap?
Well, there's still a large gap there. There's no doubt that family is extraordinarily important in a variety of ways, and I think Ian will speak to this. There's no doubt about that. I have not spent most of my time looking at families because I'm not sure that we know how, from a policy standpoint, how to change what's going on in the family. But we do have this institution called schools that's designed to try to deal with it. Right now, Coleman was sort of right in that schools, as measured conventionally, don't seem to have much influence on achievement. In other words, if you just look at how much is spent on the schools, you don't see that that has much influence on the achievement of the students in those schools. But if you go dig down and see which schools have the effective teachers and which don't, you can in fact explain a lot of the differences.
So just to be clear, the gap, the racial gap, is not merely reducible to an income gap or something along those lines. There is some other residual component, even after factoring.
There's a lot of things that we don't know, yes, past that, no doubt about that.
Ian, You've argued that we should focus less on educational achievement gaps between groups and more on lackluster educational performance across the spectrum, yet the persistence of racial achievement gaps remains striking, and there's a growing consensus that it is rooted in skill gaps that emerge very early in life, before children go to school.
Yep.
What, if anything, do you believe government should be doing to address skill gaps that emerge before children enter school?
Yeah. So first, just a perspective on closing racial achievement gaps. If you look at the mission statement for many education reform organizations, that is their single greatest focus. And I actually think it's the wrong goal. It's still the case pre-pandemic. If you look at the National Assessment for Educational Progress, Nation's Report Card, there's still only about 37% of all American kids that are reading at grade level based on NAEP proficiency. And even, as I mentioned last night, amongst white kids, for the entire history of NAEP, we've never had a situation in which I think more than 44% of white kids are reading at grade level. And yet, so the difference between white student performance and 100% is actually greater than the gaps between black and white student performance. And yet, we obsess around closing gaps versus a focus on 100% proficiency for all of our students. And the reason I think that's important is that it's not a benign focus. There are implications when we obsess over gaps, particularly racial achievement gaps. In the words of Ibram Kendi, when I see racial disparities, I see racism, full stop. So the tendency is that when you constantly focus on the singular factor of racial disparity and assume only structural racism is the cause, then you start developing theories of monocausality. There can't be anything else. It must be racism as the cause. And so if you have theories of monocausality, structural disparities by race must equal structural racism, then that means you develop monocausal solutions. Well, if there's racial discrimination, then the teachers are racist, the curriculum is racist, the tests are racist, everything's racist. And so it's not surprising that you start to see critical race theory, you see a cottage industry start to explode, because if the teachers are racist, then we have to have professional development to drive the racism out of the teachers. So that's why you see anti-racism training happening all around the country. There are schools in our country that right now are doing what are called privilege walks. Everyone know what a privilege walk is? Some of you, okay. So imagine if we were to take this room and we lined everyone up in just one horizontal line. And the teacher says to you, and so imagine this is a classroom, if you're white, take 2 steps forward, and if you're black, take 4 steps backward. And then after a series of questions like this, which are supposed to emphasize your level of oppression or your oppressor status based on skin color, at the end of the exercise, guess who's at the front of the line and guess who's at the back of the line? This is happening in schools under this premise that somehow the most important thing we need to do is help these little white kids understand their white privilege and help the black kids understand how underprivileged they are. That is the danger when we constantly focus on gaps. So I actually really challenge the premise that even this objective, the obsession with it, actually has extremely harmful implications for kids.
I have to agree with that.
Okay, score 1.
So Ian, the back half of that question was about the fact that, while it's true that we ought to focus on excellence for all students, it's also true that there are persistent, pronounced gaps, and that there is a view that some of these gaps emerged long before students enter school. So I wonder if you could offer some thoughts on what that means, and also the role of the public sector, if any.
So the other implication of this idea of monocausality in theory and then your actions is that you crowd out all the other reasons that kids might not be successful, black or white, right? So there's a reason, I said it last night, it's unlikely that systemic racism is the reason that the majority of white students have not been reading at proficiency for generations, right? And so what else is there? So unless we're able to entertain the fact that family structure, and the Coleman Report, I am constantly stunned at the number of educators who've never even heard of it, much less read it. It's really powerful. But I encourage everyone in the room to go back and read this report from the mid-1960s, because much of the analysis that he did then still holds true today. So the reason it's important, so if we start to understand the factors that drive both lack of success and success in education, strong, stable families, access to school choice, rigorous curricula, well-trained teachers. I mean, you know, we're building a high school right now, an international baccalaureate high school in the Bronx, and we're very much driven by this piece of research that says if a student reads 1 million words per year, that correlates almost always to high academic achievement. If you translate 1 million words per year based on fluency, pacing, that translates into about 25 to 30 minutes of independent reading every single day. So guess what? We're embedding in our day 25 to 30 minutes of high quality texts where that is part of what we're seeking to achieve. And if you do that, that adds about 1,000 words of vocabulary every year for kids. And if you look at the data, the strength of your vocabulary will lead to much better outcomes, not only in reading, but math, science, virtually everything else. But rarely, if you've got a monocausal view of the world that racism is the only thing, you never get to this kind of conversation. And so when you ask,
about early life interventions.
Similarly, this whole idea of access to vocabulary in the early years is also fundamental, because the gaps that we see in third grade, NAEP data, for example, at fourth grade, in most states, you start take state tests in third grade, you see these racial achievement gaps. Oh my gosh. Well, guess what? Those issues originated far earlier. And this is when it gets into sticky territory. I argue that those issues that lead to lack of preparedness in school have much less to do with biased pre-K teachers, has much more to do with unstable family structures that kids are being born and raised into.
Rick, tell us a bit about your work that Ian referenced a moment ago about teacher effectiveness. You've really been in the trenches on this issue for some time, and my understanding is that, drawing on your comparative work, you've identified evidence-based strategies that you believe could help redress this educational underperformance, drawing on the experiences of a number of other countries, a number of exemplary systems. Can you tell us a bit about the state of your understanding of the research about which strategies actually work?
Well, what we know is there's not a mono answer, policy answer either in terms of schools, that there are a number of things that add up to better, more effective schools, both from what we see in the US across schools and what we see internationally. At the very top, you have to measure performance and know whether the students are at the point that they should be or not, or whether you're doing better. And right now there's a massive movement to try to end testing, because testing gives you unfortunate answers that you don't want to hear. And so let's end testing, which is number one, the first thing that you have to avoid, or we have to be working against. Secondly, schools, the systems that give more choice of schools to parents do better. They don't, it's not overwhelming, but they do systematically better. We find that systems that reward effective teachers tend to do better. And what we have in the US, we have a couple examples in the US that I think have escaped people's observations, one of which is right here in Dallas, Texas. There are a couple major school systems in the country that adopted the idea of having serious evaluation of teachers based upon the performance of their students. one of which, the first of a major system, was Washington, D.C., which has maintained this system. And what they did was put in a very elaborate rating system for teachers. And teachers that over 2 years in a row were at the top, in the top 20% of the Washington, D.C. schools, got big rewards, increases in their base salary by a large amount. Teachers that were in the bottom 20% for 2 years in a row got fired. And DC has fired over 500 teachers and has induced a number of others to leave. And if you look at the national data, Washington, D.C. schools, which still are not exceptional, have done better in terms of gains in performance over time since this system was put into place. The system was put in place as Michelle Rhee was being pushed out the door, and that's part of the whole politics behind this. Dallas, Texas, 5 years ago, I believe, instituted a somewhat similar system of a very sophisticated evaluation of both principals and teachers based upon performance. And then they started using those ratings for the levels and pay of teachers and where they were used. What Dallas did was to show that you could take the worst schools in Dallas, you could offer teachers a bonus for teaching in these schools based upon your prior effectiveness, so that the most effective teachers who were willing to go to the worst schools got an $8,000 a year bonus. The next most effective got a $6,000 bonus, and then the middle got $4,000 or something like this. What they found was that they could induce good teachers to work in schools where they were really needed, and they found that the worst schools in Dallas, within 2 or 3 years, could come up to almost the level of the average in Dallas. So it could work. Now, I have just given you 2 examples out of 14,000 school districts in the United States. And both of these systems were put into place with enormous political cost and continual efforts to try to chip away at these systems. But it is possible, but it takes a serious effort. All of this has been just magnified, by the way, with the pandemic. But you could think of the pandemic as potentially being the answer also, because for a year and a half or 2 years, a lot of parents have been looking over the shoulders of their kids who are working on their little computers doing remote instruction. And some of them that I talk to are pretty appalled with what they've seen. Now, is there some way to mobilize these parents? I don't know.
Yes.
Ian, you've been
mobilize.
Ian, you're an accomplished school leader, and you've been deeply involved in embracing a range of different strategies to improve the effectiveness of your teachers. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your process, the trial and error process, different strategies that you've pursued, and things that you found to be particularly potent strategies.
Well, it's actually a very pertinent question because there's pedagogy, which is very important, obviously. There's pedagogy, there's subject matter knowledge, and then there's ideology of the teacher. And we're actually discovering that that third element, the ideology of the teacher, is extremely important. Whether or not they actually believe in the capacity of the children that they're teaching, or if they have a dominant, empathetic view of children that, you know, you can't expect these kids to do well. I mean, look at the environment around them. So we actually spend as much time trying to get at that mindset more than anything in our selection process. And even, I mean, this sounds crazy, so I did a couple of debates on critical race theory on C-SPAN with a professor at Brandeis who develops teachers, and God forbid the teachers that are coming out of her system. Because again, there was just such an obsession with race as being the dominant factor in almost every interaction between teachers and students. But we now make that debate of critical race theory part of our selection process when we're hiring teachers. We ask all of our teachers to watch this, and let's talk about, could you create this kind of civil discourse in the room with your students? Do you object to the things? Would you lose your ability to be objective in this conversation? And it's actually been quite helpful in screening people out. Honestly, it's very important. You have to demonstrate what you stand for when you're selecting people that you want to build your institution with you. Right?
Rick, I noticed that you were nodding in approval to Ian's remarks, which I found very helpful. It's also true that we have something on the order of 3.3 million public school teachers in the United States. You mentioned earlier on that the United States is a country in which the returns to skill are unusually high. Yet, when you think about the sheer volume of teachers that we're obliged to hire simply because of natural attrition from year to year, and then when you compare us to other market democracies where the returns to skill are not necessarily quite as high, and in which the teacher talent pool therefore looks markedly different, in which people who are perhaps higher achieving are more likely to become public school educators. So tell us about that. In a way, you could argue that with teachers, yes, you want them to be more effective. You want to embrace strategies that kind of work to improve that effectiveness over time, but also you want to be somewhat realistic about whether or not you're going to necessarily get people, say, at the 90th percentile of educational achievement themselves. So how is it that we build systems for teacher effectiveness that work for the median teacher?
Well, let me partially agree with that and then go on from there. I looked across the world at...
and then you add ideological selection into there, by the way.
Exactly.
Another element.
So none of my work has the ideological selection in it, I should say at the outset. But when I was growing up, my aunt was the valedictorian of her college class, and then went on to teach in the Cleveland public schools and become a principal. There is not a valedictorian of any college class today who would go into teaching. And in part because when she was going out into the world, women could be nurses or nurses or teachers, and they got a very highly selected group of people. Excuse me. As the world has opened up, professions open up to women and the job market changes, the people going into teaching have become less and less high achieving, and it shows up. If you look internationally, the same thing has been happening at different paces around the world, and you can see that having smarter teachers is, on average, better than having dumber teachers. That's a first statement. Now, let me qualify that, though, and say that's not the only criteria we should use for selecting teachers. There are many other things, as Ian points out. And what we know is that it is very hard to predict on the basis of an employment form who is going to be an effective teacher. Knowing how much experience a teacher has or whether they have a master's degree tells you virtually nothing about their perspective, their chances of being a highly effective teacher. So in my world, you would sort of cut down on the entry restrictions, lower the certification requirements to get into teaching, make it easier to get into teaching, but harder to stay in teaching. Because after somebody's been in the classroom for a little bit, you know whether they're going to work out or not.
Yeah, and there are residency type models too that support that.
Right, and if you're willing to make decisions afterwards, which most of our school systems are not, if you're willing to make decisions, you could radically change the quality of teachers.
Right, well, and you'd also have to deal with teachers' unions that might have something to say about getting rid of a teacher after 2 years or 3 years.
There's no doubt that teachers' unions are a bad force in terms of the learning of students. They're not the only force, though, because we have a number of right-to-work states that are not showing that they're all that much better than union states. There's something about the way we've structured and organized schools so that it pervades the way schools run, that we don't make decisions that are in the interests of the kids in the class as opposed to the adults in the class.
Ian, you are a deep believer in the power of the success sequence, which is at the heart of your forthcoming book. Critics of the success sequence argue that success sequencers get the direction of causality wrong. The success that's being attributed to the sequence itself is more appropriately ascribed to other factors. For example, being raised in a more stable home or neighborhood environment can give young people more certainty about the future and the likelihood that investments in their human capital will pay off. What do these critics get wrong?
Well, actually, it's not that they're wrong. I mean, the way that I as with everything, telling a story is helpful. So as we've been designing this high school, we've traveled to other great high schools across the country. So I went to New Orleans and visited this great high school there and visited a class of 9th graders. And the teacher introduced me and I said, hi, my name is Ian Rowe and I'm designing this high school, but there's this content that I want to teach that's pretty prickly. There are folks that are not comfortable talking about pathways to upward mobility. And I said to this group of 9th graders, who, by the way, almost all low income, almost all black, and I said to them, if you knew that there are a series of decisions in your control that, for the vast majority of people that make those same decisions, 97% of the time avoid poverty. I said, would you want to know that? And they looked at me and said, well, of course we'd want to know that. And I said, well, there are a whole bunch of people that think I shouldn't teach you this because I might be moralizing or I might be somehow suggesting that the reason that maybe you're impoverished is because of something that your parents did and we don't want to embarrass you. And they looked at me like I had a third eye, right? Why would you deprive this information from us? It was a very powerful moment because I realized there are all these gatekeepers, all these critics who, by the way, follow the success sequence in their own lives. And for those of you that don't know, the success sequence: finish your high school degree, full-time job of any kind, just you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and if you have children, marriage first, right? But these critics, these gatekeepers, want to keep this information away. So we proceeded to have this conversation with the 9th graders, and it was amazing because what I felt was that the students felt that they had been respected as future decision makers in their own life. I wasn't dictating to them that this must be what you do in your life, but you should know, here are the probabilities, the likely rewards or consequences with this series of decisions, with this series of decisions, with this series of decisions. But you're going to be the architect. Oh my God, that's my Apple Watch. I must have said something either intelligent or really stupid.
Siri is listening.
Yes, seriously. So anyway, so we talked about the success. So my perspective is I ignore all that stuff because I want to put kids who within 4 to 8 years are going to be making decisions about relationships, about their education, about a whole series of decisions as they enter young adulthood. And I want to put them in power of their own lives and not base my decisions on cultural critics who have already had the benefits of following the success sequence in their own life and yet are trying to deprive kids of that information.
Rick, you have done a lot of work on the peer racial composition of schools and whether or not it has some implications for black student achievement. I think it's fair to say that many of us in this room believe that a fixation on integration efforts over some of these other strategies that Ian and others have championed is foolish and counterproductive. But again, your work does suggest that black students fare better in more racially integrated schools. Yet efforts to actively manage peer racial composition have proven politically and practically intractable. And there's a widespread sense that these efforts represent a deeply pessimistic set of beliefs about majority black schools, that they simply can't succeed in the absence of integration efforts. Tell us about how you've approached the question of racial integration, what you believe are appropriate strategies. What's the right way for us to think about it?
Well, the analysis you're talking about is that some time ago I looked at schools in Texas and found basically that black students did poorer if there were higher concentrations of black students also in that school, and that this particularly harmed the highest achieving black students, which I interpret as saying that there are positive effects of desegregation, but that's something different than what policies you institute, because we basically don't have many instruments of the old-fashioned post-Brown way of forcing integration in schools. We have, for example, there's a lawsuit going on currently in Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, about desegregation of the schools. And there's effective, even if you ignore whether it would be legally permissible to put in place some desegregation policy, it would just not work because of the distribution of residents of black and white students. And so to me, it comes back down to, we know how to improve schools. When I say teacher effectiveness, I can take a moment to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. We know that if we look at two different classrooms of kids and take into account where they start, and then look at where they end up, that there are wild differences within the same school between teachers. So in the schools of Gary, Indiana, I once looked at the outcomes of their schools for a group of all minority, all poor kids, and looked at how much difference it would make which teacher they had. And you could find in the same school one teacher that was providing a year and a half's worth of education. They were ahead of the curriculum in providing a year and a half of the average for their grade. And in the same school, you could find teachers who were providing half a year of education on average to the kids in her class. So that depending upon which room you got assigned to, you could come out a full year difference in learning and skills. We don't do anything with that information, even though I don't think it's a secret. If you go into any school in the country, and Ian has done a lot of this, in his first 20 minutes in that school, I dare say that he knows who are the really ineffective teachers in that school and who are the effective teachers. But every principal knows, every other teacher in the school knows who are good and not. Every parent knows. And I usually say, and the janitor knows too. I mean, that this is no secret. What the fact is that we won't use that information that is common information, that is there, that has such a dramatic impact on the outcomes of the kids.
Ian, there's another factor that seems to be associated with educational performance, which is the presence or absence of disruptive students in a class. This has some bearing on the debates over, for example, size of the classroom, student-teacher ratios, and what have you. One argument that I know Rick and others have engaged with is the idea that it's less class size per se, and it's how much time teachers have to devote to disruptive students. Yet, as you know, the question of school discipline has become enormously contentious it's a conversation that I think it's reasonable to say has been racialized about the idea that school discipline outcomes are disparate, that there is a so-called school-to-prison pipeline, and therefore we need to more stringently scrutinize how different groups are treated when it comes to school discipline. Tell us a little bit about your experience as a school leader and more broadly your thoughts on school discipline as it relates to classroom effectiveness.
Yes, and before I go there, I just have to address the issue of segregated schools and black-white. You know, this is a tough issue. You know, I run schools that are all black and Hispanic. You know, it's not as if I'm waiting to shuttle a group of white students into my school in order for it to be successful. And I think it's just really important that there is this ideology, and Bob Woodson's in the room, you know, if it's all black, it must be bad. And that is the most noxious notion that we just have to dispel. And Bob would punch me. And Bob would punch me after this if I didn't mention the Rosenwald schools, which continues today the most incredible example of 100+ years ago, Booker T. Washington, in the midst of Jim Crow and segregation and all these terrible things happening to black kids, he says, no, I want to create a network of schools committed to black excellence. Black teachers, black students. He partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who's the CEO of the Sears Roebuck Company at the time, and they built nearly 5,000 schools throughout the South and demanded that the communities match in funding and effort to build these schools. And the level of academic achievement was incredible. Maya Angelou was a Rosenwald graduate, John Lewis, and the irony that despite this excellence, it was the Brown versus Board of Education decision that made the assumption that separate must mean unequal and thus inferior, made the Rosenwald schools unconstitutional and closed some of the highest performing black schools in the history of our country.
You know, it's important that you underscore that. I mean, there's this recent push against charter schools on the argument that they create schools that have all black kids.
Oh my God, heaven forbid.
Schools of choice that are, then they're trying to close them because of the racial composition.
Would either be care to touch upon the school discipline issue?
Yeah, no, I'll come back to school discipline. Right, I will. But we open schools where the need is there. If that happens to be black, fine. If it happens to be I'd open schools in Appalachia too, right? So it's not, it is this nonsensical, anyway.
It's a dishonest
all black
discussion.
Can be exceptional. That's the point. In terms of school discipline, absolutely, it has become politicized. You'll see all sorts of data. Black boys are suspended at higher rates. And again, monocausality, in theory, leads to monocausality in action intervention. So if you believe that black boys are being suspended at a disproportionate rate to whites, and you believe that that must be caused by racism, then you've got your discipline systems are faulty, the teachers are racist. So let's move to restorative justice. And that's a term that's very popular now in K-12 education, where you're essentially removing, you start to create disincentives. And President Obama several years ago, in a Dear Colleague letter, essentially said that the federal government would come down on you if you had disciplinary rates that showed disproportionately high levels of black students being disciplined. So guess what? Teachers and others said no, and then you had higher numbers of very disruptive kids in school. And there are all sorts of incidents, and teachers will tell you that they feel disempowered to do anything. And again, this is all part of the same phenomena. Monocausality, disparity in outcomes leads to a set of interventions which assume racial discrimination. And the negative outcomes occur, but because we're trapped in this ideology, we can't confront it. And I said I want this conference to be about courage. This is one of those examples where you have to have the courage to call out this nonsense.
Ian, do you know of any effective strategies, effective models for dealing with students who prove to be persistently disruptive? Because I suppose one anxiety people have is the idea that you have students who early in life have various behavioral, emotional challenges, prove disruptive, and there is a kind of fear about those students being abandoned, relegated to the margins. So given your skepticism about some of the fads and fashions around restorative justice and what have you, what do you see as strategies to help ensure that students who do have these challenges can nevertheless get a second chance?
Suspensions can work. No, it's an appropriate penalty for antisocial behavior. That's actually one of the lessons to be learned in school. It doesn't mean that you're excessive or you do it wantonly, but if there's a student that is actively impeding the learning environment for other kids, that student has to be removed. Sometimes you can do an in-school suspension where the kid is still learning. Sometimes it's an out-of-school suspension that you're working with the parents or caregivers. But we don't run away from the responsibility to all of our students to cater to the interests of one. And by the way, you might actually be teaching the worst lesson to everyone if you ignore the penalty that is justified for a particular set of behaviors.
Rick, there is perhaps a tension between one approach, which is to say we have evidence-based strategies that work, and let's work with big urban school districts to scale up these approaches. When you, for example, were citing some of these innovative approaches in Washington, D.C., in Dallas, and of course many other jurisdictions, one of the virtues here is that particularly when we're talking about the scale of the number of public school teachers in the country, that can actually be helpful. We want to kind of keep scale in mind, right? There's another view, which you're also not unsympathetic to, which is that we want to let 1,000 flowers bloom. We want to have different school networks that enjoy a wide range of autonomy to experiment, to pursue a variety of different strategies. One could argue that those are approaches that are perhaps in tension. Tell us about how you resolve that tension, how you think about it.
There is some tension there, but I think as an economist that you want to get the right incentives there and then let people make their choices and do what they can do. Not every good school is going to look like Ian's school, but there are other good schools, and you want to reward the outcomes, not how it's structured. So let me come back to Texas, where we're sitting here with, there ought to be a single star flag around someplace. Texas, the legislature had a major reform of the school finance, but they looked at what I described as going on in Dallas before, of giving these performance-based incentives to teach in poor schools. And the legislature structured a program that was generic, and they said, you don't have to do what Dallas did, but what you have to do, if you can show that you have a serious evaluation system for teachers based on their effectiveness, and that you use that to help staff disadvantaged students, we'll give you a pot of money from the state, a bonus, and that bonus actually follows the teacher. There was an attempt to try to get a market going for good teachers. That hasn't been in place long enough to be sure that it's working, but it seems to have the right structure to me, where you don't try to dictate from Austin or any state capital, or worse yet from Washington, D.C., how schools operate. What you do is try to provide incentives for the performance that you want to see and the skills that you want to see them creating.
Let's open it up to questions. I see there's a gentleman in the back.
Do I need a microphone? Yahya Fanusi, Center for New American Security. Just a quick question from the forgotten Generation X. And I have an observation in terms of the education movies and TV shows that I watched
Right.
And these were all movies, TV movies, and feature films about the empowerment mindset versus the victim mindset. So my question is, you all who have looked at these models and are involved in this, have you considered engaging TV, media, and film, TV and film media to highlight these stories and to bring the empowerment mindset to the culture of today?
Ian, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. So in a former life, I used to lead all of the programming at MTV. That was my, anyway, it's a long story. But for 6 years, I had the power to deliver messages to tens of millions of young people across the United States and across the world. And it was very much this message on a range of issues, not just in education, but how to have young people understand their agency. And we often used an approach that it's the grown-ups and the adults who are trying to keep something from you. And so similar to the story I shared earlier about the 9th graders in New Orleans. But yeah, the thing about those examples though, those were sort of one against the odds type story. Like Joe Clark was the principal running around and like beating on kids. Like that's, and almost always showing the kids in the stereotypical view. But the vast majority of black kids are not going to prison. The vast majority of black kids are not living in poverty. And so somehow the media is not always our friend on these issues because they tend to perpetuate the stereotypes that we are trying to dispel and normalize things like the success sequence, for example. I mean, there are several people in this room who would love to launch a national campaign around normalizing this set of decisions of finishing your school, work, marriage, and children, to create a new social norm around that. And I'm very interested, as one of the byproducts of this conference, to pursue ideas like that. How do we make the media help schools not have to hold the full burden of having to try to address all of these issues, right? So I do think there is a critical role, and it's not just for K-12 education to solve.
So I would just add that the one time that I've participated in any of this was Waiting for Superman, where I had spent a lot of time with them trying to convince them who were inherently not pro-choice coming into it, but came out of it pro-choice.
There's a gentleman back there.
Hello. I think that I try to assume positive intent, which is obviously getting more difficult these days. But outside of the radicals, I know that there are people who understand, because what's important is the results, what solutions and what works. And I think that there are people amongst the people who are pushing the bad ideology who want things that work, but they prioritize the race over the solution. So I'm wondering what you think of a way that we can get those who will listen to understand that even if you give them their argument, that what they're trying to do won't work. Quickly, I'm in New York, as you know, Ian, and I live in Midtown Manhattan. And so my son's at a successful school, international school, students from all over the world. He's the only black kid in his class. So they're trying to implement DEI, so they wanted to get the parents involved. I'm on a Zoom call with about 20 people. I am the only man on the call, and only one of 2 blacks, the other one's an administrator. And they, to my face, told me that they believe that blacks are inherently different than whites, and that we are oppressed. So I'm oppressed, and my son, by extension, is oppressed. But their mission, like you say, is anti-racism, is to close the racial gap and to treat everyone the same. So I simply asked, how are you going to treat me the same if you're telling me I'm different? So even to give me the same results, you have to treat me differently in order to treat me the same. So how do we get them to understand? I'm sure that they have positive intent and they think it's going to work. So how do we get the ones who will listen to understand that you are making things worse regardless of why you're doing it?
Oh boy. So in Glenn's speech, which I thought was brilliant, he said several times that the folks who are pushing that ideology, it's a bluff. You hear him say that? It's a bluff. They're daring you to respond, to call out this nonsense on the presumption that you are going to be too fearful as the lone black person on this call. Maybe you think, oh my God, if I speak out, are they somehow going to do something to my kids? Am I going to be thrown out? They're counting on you to say nothing. Wait, turn on your mic.
No, yeah, I doubled down. What I actually said was, I said what I said about you're going to treat me the same by pointing out that I'm different, but I want to, it's not lost on this call that I am the only black voice here, so I'm hoping that as one of the few black parents, and my son being the only black in the class, that your voice on race isn't stronger than my voice.
Right. So first of all, thank you for demonstrating that courage, because I think that's where it has to start. The only way we can actually get into the conversation of why this is harmful is if you actually have the audacity to say, I completely disagree with the premise of your statement. That's what Glenn is asking us for. And then, by the way, there's tons of research, and again, perhaps after this conference we can share a lot of it, about the data that shows the debilitating impact on both kids of color as well as white kids when there are these myths about inherent inferiority or inherent marginalization or inherent oppression. We've got tons of data, but I often find the first step is confronting the nonsense in the first place. And our opponents are relying on you to be silent. And that is what we have to break.
Let's see. There's someone right there. Yep, please.
Well, Ian, I'm going to ask you an unfair question. So as we think about your brilliance and how America can most effectively, how America can most effectively leverage it. And I think about 3 possible jobs for you. Secretary of Education.
In the federal government?
In the federal government.
No, I want to eliminate that department.
But let me Chancellor of the Chicago school system. Or the role that you're presently in, where you're driving private sector dollars to build these institutions. Now, I assume I know your answer, but where do you think the greatest leverage points are across those 3?
Nike, that's a great question. And by the way, Nike Fajor is my partner on the Invisible Men podcast. If you're looking for a great podcast to discover incredible black men, he's my partner in that. It's a good question. I think I'd actually choose Chancellor of the Chicago public school system. Because within that infrastructure, I have power. I could have charter schools, I could build relationships, I could create voucher programs so that the public money that comes into my system, I'd have the ability to at least advocate, to give that power to parents, to be able to choose any school within the Chicago locality or perhaps even outward. In terms of the federal government, it is very murky to me what positive role the Federal Department of Education plays right now. And, and running a charter school network, for sure, I have incredible amounts of freedom. And we are, I think, collectively having systemic impact. I mean, there are now 5 million kids in charter schools across the country, nearly 3 million on wait lists, and we are definitely pushing against the system. But it's going to take time. So if I had to choose out of those 3, I'd take the chancellor of a school system because at the end of the day, even being a charter school leader, to some degree, I am at the mercy of the types of regulations that person has a greater ability to advocate for.
I wonder if we have a question for Rick. This will be our last one. Let's see, there's a gentleman back here.
Yeah, Patrick Wolf, University of Arkansas. Rick, you alluded to the fact that public school systems with more choice and competition produce better results, and there's a strong literature on that. The response for people who are opposed to education reform and choice is that, well, the problem is that competition produces winners and losers, and K-12 education serves children. We don't want any children to be losers. And so competition may drive excellence in every other aspect of our lives, but K-12 is a magical place where we can't have competition or children will be hurt. How do you respond to that?
I was waiting to see if there was a question. I agree with your statement. The argument has been made all over the place that charter schools take funds and resources away from the public schools, and they're harming the public schools. They take kids away. That's why the funds go away. And so this is kind of a crazy argument, but state legislatures around the country have stepped in to say, well, if your enrollment goes down, we'll make up for that by giving you extra money so that you aren't hurt. And this is just the opposite response, in fact, by our elected officials who respond to bad media discussions of the issue.
Please join me in thanking Ian and Rick for their important work.
Thank you.
And thank you also to the organizers of the Old Parkland Conference for giving us an opportunity to discuss these important issues. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Gotcha.
Thank you very much.